Welcome, Brookhaven Innovation Academy. This is the K-3 Mathematics Professional Development Series, and we're at session 1, Hybrid Learning with Go Math. My name is Heather Robinson, and I will be working with you through this professional learning series. I wanted to share a little bit about me. I am the President and Chief Education Officer of Cross and Dot LLC, which is an educational consulting firm that serves several charter school and public school districts throughout the state of Georgia. I am delighted to be here with you to take you through this professional learning series. While my experience is not K-5, I spent my teaching career as a high school mathematics teacher. Mathematics and the mathematical pedagogy required to give students a high level of student achievement is absolutely my passion. I'm excited to support you over the next few weeks, and I'm really excited to meet you in person in November. Thank you all so much for completing the survey. It was quite helpful in planning for this first session today. 9 out of 10 of you responded to the question about challenges with hybrid learning, and the same number of you responded about challenges with Go Math. So today we are going to dive pretty deep into some of those challenges that you shared with hybrid learning. And we're also going to spend some time talking about how you can utilize Go Math in your classroom from about a 50,000 foot level to ensure that hybrid learning is meeting your students who are in the fully virtual environment and those students who are in your face-to-face classroom. So let's talk about hybrid instruction. Let's start there. First, I want to say to you all, thank you for what you do every day. Teachers are in an unprecedented time, and you are doing something that none of us have ever done before. I was fortunate enough at the end of my teaching career to be able to teach in a full-time virtual school program. I was also fortunate enough to be the inaugural leader of the state's first K-12 full-time virtual public charter school, Georgia Connections Academy. So from the perspective of virtual teaching and learning, I absolutely understand the challenges that you all are facing. What I've never experienced is having to do both. I've never had the opportunity to be in a classroom where I'm the teacher responsible for managing students who are physically in front of me and available for direct delivery of instruction, and also managing students who are working remotely from home simultaneously. So again, thank you for what you're doing, and we're going to do whatever we can here at Cross and Dot to support you and help you move through these challenging times. I want to start with the definition of hybrid. So in my head, I didn't have a clear picture of what that word actually meant. So I went to the Merriam-Webster dictionary and found that the word hybrid means having two different components performing essentially the same function. And I think that's it. That's what you all are trying to do in your classrooms and your virtual classrooms right now. You have two different settings. You have your in-person setting and you have your remote setting, and they're both supposed to be providing the function of instruction to your students. So how do we do this? How do we ensure that the students who are in front of you are getting the same level of learning as the students who are working remotely, and vice versa? While I don't really have an answer directly to that, I certainly have some strategies that you can employ today in order to bridge that gap. One of the things that I like to share with clients who are implementing virtual learning in their school right now is what I call the 5 components of virtual learning success. In order for any virtual program, whether it is part-time, full-time, whether you have a hybrid situation, there are 5 pieces that must be working well and must be working in collaboration with each other in order for the virtual learning to be a success. The first is curriculum. You have to have a strong curriculum. Teachers have to have a curriculum plan. You have to know what you expect students to learn, which is the first essential question of a professional learning community. You also have to have strong management systems, and you have to have strong management systems in a brick and mortar school as well. But these management systems that we use in virtual learning become our building. So things like Google Classroom, things like the Zoom platform, those are now your building where the learning is happening. Those management systems have to be robust, they have to be reliable, and they have to be user-friendly. The third component are the schooling processes and policies. We all have that nailed down. We know exactly how school is supposed to work when those students arrive in the building, all the way through the time that they leave from the after school program. What we have to do when we are building a virtual learning program is we have to modify those processes and policies, and we have to think about those what if situations that virtual learning is going to present. One of the most common school processes and policies that is always in need of adjustment when you are launching a virtual learning program is the attendance policy. We know very clearly in a brick and mortar school, when a student is physically present, they are present, and we count them as having attended school for that class or for that day. Well, when we are in a virtual setting, what does that look like? What does being present now mean? And that's a process that sometimes takes some tweaking and sometimes takes some trial and error in order to figure out. The most important part of your virtual learning success is a part that I personally believe when the pandemic hit in March, many schools missed out on, and that's synchronous instruction. That's what we're doing right now. If you were in this room with me, and that's what your virtual students are doing when they're in that room, when you're in your physical classroom, that synchronous instruction is priceless. And it's priceless and it's the most essential because of you. It doesn't matter how many fancy management systems you get. I don't care how wonderful your curriculum is. It doesn't matter if you have all the best school processes and policies. If we don't have teachers providing direct instruction, providing feedback, grading, and communicating on a day-to-day basis with students, whether it's face-to-face or whether it's in person, your virtual learning program cannot be a success, just like your brick and mortar program can't be a success. And the final piece of this wheel is professional learning. We all know how important it is that our teachers continue to learn and grow, whether it's in their subject area or their grade band, but it's always important to make sure that teachers are equipped with the tools that they need in order to be successful. Well, virtual learning for, I would venture to say, all of you was a new adventure. And I hope that you had some professional learning either on management systems, on the changes to school processes and policies. But my greatest wish or my greatest hope is that you had some training and some professional learning on the synchronous instruction. If you didn't, we're going to get some today. So no worries. I'm really excited about my conversations with your leadership and the things that we're going to help you improve as we move along. So this is the 5 components of success for virtual learning. But again, right now, Brookhaven Innovation Academy is not doing full-time virtual learning. You all are learning in a hybrid setting. So those 5 components don't change. But what does change for hybrid learning success is what becomes most important. So if you notice, those management systems really increased in size. The importance of management systems in your hybrid learning success is now amplified. The same for synchronous instruction. That's amplified. Those students who are at home deserve the same experience as those students who are sitting in your physical classroom. And then, of course, if synchronous instruction and management systems become even more important, then the professional learning that goes along with using those management systems and providing that synchronous instruction also has to amplify. This doesn't mean that curriculum and schooling processes and policies are less important. It just means the size of these circles is just to share with you how loud the volume needs to be in management systems, synchronous instruction, and professional learning when compared to curriculum and schooling processes and policies. Those 3 in the situation that you all are in with hybrid learning are most definitely the most important. And I hope that you agree. So how do we know if our students are ready to learn? Or how can we as teachers ensure that our students are ready to learn? And that's why I have the question mark. How do I know, or how can I, as the instructional leader, make sure that I am providing that parallel experience for my in-person learners and for my virtual learners? So what we have here in this set of diagrams, or in this table, is I wanted to look at 5 key things that happen in your in-person classroom. So we've got classroom management, we have direct instruction, we have assessment, we have small group instruction, and we have learning materials. Those are 5 things that are happening in your classroom, maybe not on a daily basis for some of these, but certainly on a regular basis. For your in-person learners, classroom management is happening by the teacher. Well, in order for your virtual learners to be ready to learn, that classroom is now managed by the learning coach. And we could do an entire class on the differences and the nuances that come up between a classroom being managed by the teacher and a classroom being managed by the learning coach. When I say learning coach, I'm referring to parents, grandparents, older siblings, whoever is at home with your students during the typical school day. That's the person that's managing the classroom. And for most of your students, that person is not a trained educator. That person has never had to manage their student's academic schedule. They've never had to manage their student wiggling in a seat. They've never had to manage their student doing their classwork in a quiet environment. They've never had to set up a schooling environment for their student. So imagine the challenges that that learning coach is engaging with. And now let's talk about the challenges that you're engaging with for those students whose classroom is being managed by the learning coach. As teachers, we've lost control of one of the most basic pieces of our instructional stories. We no longer know when that student, or can control when that student is going to log into class, if that student is going to log into class. So that level of control is no longer ours. So we have to figure out ways to communicate with families about managing the classroom. The best strategy that I can give you for those learners that you have learning virtually is to teach your parents how to help you. If you have a weekly newsletter, put a tip in there for parents on classroom management or scheduling for their students. Make sure that your students learn the virtual routine. Constant reminders. Yes, we are in October. Yes, we've been doing this for 2 or 3 months, but they still need those reminders that coming to class on time is important. Coming to class at all is important. Turning in your homework when it is assigned is important. All of those things for your virtual learners have to be retaught, and you have to teach that learning coach how to help you manage their student. With direct instruction is happening in the classroom. You're moving around, you're checking on students, you're handing out papers. But now for your virtual learners, they're missing out on that experience. So direct instruction, instead of it being that hands-on teacher to student eye-to-eye connection, now that direct instruction is happening in the Zoom classroom. Now that direct instruction is happening in a portal where you have to scroll through the cameras to see if the student is even paying attention to what you're doing. With assessment for your in-person learners is proctored by the teacher. You hand the students the test, or you ask the students to log into the test, since you all are a one-to-one classroom, and you're watching them, ensuring that they're not using any unapproved tools, and you also don't have any adult in the background helping them through. Well, that's not necessarily the case for your virtual learners. That assessment, while it's still online, is still being proctored by the learning coach. And that learning coach, again, isn't a trained educator. And sometimes as parents, and I'm a parent too, it's hard to watch our students struggle. So again, this is where communication comes in tenfold. It's very important that our learning coaches understand that assessment has to be proctored in order for us to know what their student is learning. That also lends to trust in your school community. Building trust with your parents and with your learning coaches is extremely important during this time, because if their child is struggling, they need to know that you, as their student's teacher, are there to help them, that their student will have multiple opportunities, hopefully, to demonstrate learning, and that you are there to provide additional support and resources, even virtually, to their student. Another area where what's happening for your in-person learners is different for your virtual learners is in small group instruction. In our physical classrooms, we're able to separate students into groups. We're able to think, pair, share immediately. We're able to design those small groups physically for those students to interact with each other and to learn collaboratively. Well, that happens now for our virtual learners in things like breakout rooms for small group instruction, or depending on how many learners you have online, they may become their own small group. And that again is another thing for teachers to manage. You're managing those students in the small group physically in front of you, but you also have to make sure that the conversations and collaboration are happening for those students who are in that small group virtually. And if you have breakout rooms, that's a manipulation. That means you're going in and out of different rooms. You're checking on students while you also have students in front of you. That's a challenge. The last discrepancy I want to talk about is the learning materials. So in your brick and mortar, in your traditional classroom, the learning materials are available. If students need to use building blocks, or if students need to model something for you, you hand them those materials, or you allow them to log into your virtual manipulatives. The same thing can be happening, or should be happening, for your virtual learners. However, again, we're dependent on the coach's actions. If you sent a manipulative to be printed out, or if you sent a manipulative just to be uploaded, you've got to rely on that learning coach to make sure that your student has those materials ready. And again, that is an exercise in intense communication that you as the teacher have to provide, or need to provide, for your learning coach in order for them to be successful. Now, I know what you're thinking. Yep, I'm trying to do all these things. I'm trying to do everything that's on this left side with the in-person learners, and I'm trying to do everything I can on the right side for virtual learners. But at the end of the day, one of these takes precedence. And I would venture to say that for many of you, what's taking precedence are the students in front of you. And that's absolutely normal, and that's absolutely expected. What we're going to talk about is how you shift that so that all students are feeling and are getting an equal instructional experience. And now you might be surprised at what I'm about to share and what I'm about to say, but I hope that you will trust me, or grant me a little trust, and go with me all the way here. So the one thing, if there's one thing that you hear me say today, or in this 1 hour session, is that virtual learning is king in the hybrid scenario. When you have multiple settings for learning, the default for instructional equivalency, I won't use the word equity, but to ensure that all learners have equal access, the virtual learning should be your go-to. I'm saying that with the caveat of a couple of things that I know are happening at BIA. One is that you all are a one-to-one school. Every student in your classroom has a device, and your students at home have a device. That is a benefit, and that is quite honestly a luxury that many of our charter schools don't have. But being that you have that advantage, you should leverage that advantage. Look at your classroom from the virtual view. Pull in the things you need in your in-person classroom. Again, I know that may be a switch, but like I said, go with me on this one. So let's talk about the curriculum. As a one-to-one school, your curriculum is online. You all are using Go Math for your mathematics instruction, and that curriculum is online. You have your e-text, you have all of those resources embedded within Go Math. So that virtual view for the curriculum is quite easy. When you tell students to turn to page 4, they're all logging in. Those students who are on their computers at home should also be doing the same thing. How do you demonstrate that? Again, you have to approach it from the virtual view. If you have students in a Zoom classroom, you should be in the Zoom classroom, and you should be projecting that Zoom classroom on the larger screen for your other students to see. So everyone has that Zoom classroom view, and that accomplishes two things. You don't have two devices, or a physical device and a virtual device, doing two things. You're consolidating all of that into one. So if you're showing your virtual classroom on your larger screen and you're teaching as if you're teaching virtually, let me stop there. That doesn't mean you're ignoring the kids in front of you. That means that you are logged into that virtual classroom setting, and that's where the presentation happens. It doesn't even mean that you're not physically walking around your classroom. If we physically set your classroom up where the camera from your device is always on you, or you train yourself to only stand in places where you can be seen, then you are essentially inviting and incorporating that virtual classroom right into your physical classroom. But again, I'm supposed to be talking about curriculum right now. So you all have that great Go Math curriculum that is already digital. It is a click of a button, hopefully, for you to upload that into your virtual classroom and share that with all of your students. Because one of the benefits of Zoom is that you can share your screen just like I am right now. And your students who are working virtually can see what you're doing. And your students who are physically in front of you are looking at the whiteboard and seeing what you're doing. Again, I'm going to roll around here to management systems and how important that is. The Google Classroom is everyone's classroom. That's now even for your students who are physically in front of you. Zoom is where the virtual students just enter the classroom. So those management systems are important. You've got to have your Google Classroom operating effectively, and you also have to know how to manage all those wonderful things in the Google Classroom. So it's great to know how to embed a rubric into an assessment. It's fantastic to know how to use Google Forms as a pliable way to create assessments for your students. It's also important to know how to use the polling feature in Zoom. It's important to know how to turn mics off and turn mics on, and turn cameras off and turn cameras on in Zoom. That adds to your classroom management. But what I will share with you is that if you go from the virtual view first and then bring in your physical students into that virtual space, you really are managing one classroom. Another consideration to think about here is inviting your physical students into the Zoom classroom. But again, depending on what the activity is, I may or may not recommend that, just depending on the lesson. Those schooling processes and policies. Review your guidance again for attendance, work completion, and behavior management. It's really important that you know what the school's expectation is on attendance for your virtual students. Again, we're going to start with the virtual view. For work completion, if your students in your physical classroom, I'm not going to say are handing in an assignment, because we're thinking about it from the virtual view. But if they are sitting on their device and they are completing an assignment in Go Math and they are turning it in, maybe even via Google Classroom, then your virtual students should have that same expectation in that same real time. Same thing for behavior management. Like I said earlier, it's important to know how to manage that virtual classroom. We know how to manage that physical classroom. Next is synchronous instruction. Another one of those pieces of this wheel where the volume has really been turned up. Use your Zoom tools to project to your physical classroom, not vice versa. So don't use your physical tools to try to hold things up and show the students. my camera is tiny here. And it's equally as tiny for your students if they're working on a Chromebook or on an iPad. So it's really important that what is being shown in full view for all of your students. The easiest way to do that is for your Zoom classroom to be projected onto your whiteboard that's in your room. And listen, if you don't have a whiteboard in your room, go old school. Get one of those little projectors, find a clear wall or your whiteboard and project it. Connect your computer. But having that virtual classroom be where everything is happening, everyone has an equal view. Professional learning. The most important thing I can say about this is that teamwork makes the dream work. There is no better, more opportune time for teachers to be collaborating than now. It is essential that you talk to your colleagues. It is essential that you find out what they're doing that's working well in their hybrid learning. It's also essential that you're finding out those things that really didn't work well when they're doing hybrid learning. As a community, sharing those successes and failures is the greatest professional learning that you can have. When we meet together in person in November, I'm already going to prep you. One of the first question that I'm going to ask you is, where are you glowing and where are you growing? It's very important that as colleagues, you are sharing things that are going well and things that need improvement, because I promise you, usually the audience, your colleagues, has a solution for you, or they need to learn from you. And again, I'm back at curriculum. Using your Google Classroom and Go Math digital tools, it is important, it is essential. And because the virtual view is the view that should be taking precedent, you have to minimize print material requirements. If there is something that is absolutely print, you must figure out a way to guarantee that your students who are working virtually have access to it. And sometimes that means snail mail. If you have physical manipulators that you're using, or if you have a worksheet that you really want the student to write on, we can't guarantee that all of our students have a printer. We can do one of two things in that instance. We can edit that document so that it is editable for our students to return to us. And I also recognize that we are talking about K-3 students, and I'll speak to that in a second, or send it to them in the mail. That takes planning, that takes coordination, and it can't be last minute. But remember, think about it from the virtual view. You want them to be ready at home because you know those students who are in your physical classroom are going to be ready with things like that. And you want to create an equitable classroom environment. Now, when it comes to print materials or having editable forms for your K-3 students, that's an underlying school process or classroom process and policy that you have to be practicing with your students. Always sharing with your virtual students how to do these things as you are teaching your physical in-person students how to do those things as well. One of my favorite things to do with my students was to create little mini videos and post them in my Google Classroom that they can always have access to. So if they forget how to submit a form, short things like that really help students and help your learning coaches to be able to help you. It also is a great idea, rounding back to professional learning for a second, is if you as a team do these together. If you have colleagues or as a group, you all can decide who's going to do the video on editable forms, who's going to do the video on logging in correctly, who's going to do the video on how to raise your hand in Zoom. If you all can collaborate on that work together, it will make the village that much stronger. So now let's switch gears and let's go to a discussion about using Go Math. So we've talked about strategies for increasing the equalities in hybrid learning and ways for you to effectively reach students in both settings. Again, if there's nothing else that you remember that I share in this session, please remember the virtual view is the best view. The virtual view is the view where all students, particularly in a one-to-one environment, can have equitable learning experiences. So let's talk now about using GoMath. GoMath is certainly a robust and diverse set of resources, and I have been excited to learn about that over the past few weeks. So in learning with GoMath, several of you communicated a few challenges with the platform. One that I want to address, well, two that I want to address. The first one is with a lag. There were a couple of people who indicated that the program lags, and so students become disengaged and students lose that excitement. For me, that's not necessarily something that I can help you conquer, but I certainly would advise you to share that with your leadership, because it sounds like that might be a connectivity issue when you have multiple learners online. I would also be curious to discuss when we meet in November if your learners who are working virtually at home are having that same experience with GoMath. And the other is, and it's really the first bullet here under classroom management, is professional learning. Please make sure that you spend time engaging in how to use those features within GoMath. I will spend some time doing that with you in session 2 and also when we meet in person, but there's not going to be anything that replaces you working with each other and also sharing with each other the cool tips and tricks that you're finding as you continue to work through GoMath. So I want to start in the box. I want to start with just talking about some strategies that I would suggest for general use in GoMath. And these are just items that on a day-to-day basis, you can be using GoMath for in your classrooms. Of course, introducing new topics. There are lots of interactive videos, lots of support opportunities for students, pre-assessments, checks, all of those things are there to support you. Another strategy for general use is the reteaching and the tier 1 support. So when student assessments show that a standard or a domain was not quite attained by your students at the level that you would expect, then use GoMath as the go-to or the go back to in order to reteach for your students. It's also got all of your homework there. So I saw a lot of opportunities for students to practice, both individually as small groups and with guided practice. And then journaling. One of the most wonderful things or the most memorable things that I saw as I was exploring GoMath was that students have the opportunity to create journal entries. Now, I was a little disappointed that those journal entries are not interactive, but because you have access to a Google Classroom, you can certainly launch students into a journal and ask them to complete that activity in a Google Doc and share that Google Doc with you or turn that Google Doc in as an assignment. So the journaling information that's there are great prompts. You'll have to do a little work to make them interactive from that virtual view so that all students can turn them into you virtually. But I think it's worth it in order to encourage students, especially our younger students, to write about math. Some of the good tools, the top 3 good tools that I liked was the resource library. I liked that it wasn't tagged and monitored, so students can go in there and look for a lot of different things. But the vocabulary exercises for grades 3 through 6, from the ones that I viewed, were excellent. I am a big proponent in learning across the curriculums, but I'm a huge component that students learn appropriate mathematical vocabulary. So I was really pleased to see that embedded within GoMath. And then also those real life applications. As a high school math teacher, where the number 1 question that I would get is, when am I going to use this? I love that embedded in that GoMath curriculum for grades 3 through 6, when they start to formulate that question, are embedded in there, that they can see places where math is used in career, in their day-to-day life, or in others' day-to-day lives. So now let's go back to those 5 topics that I talked about earlier in paralleling in-person learning to virtual learning. And now we know that we need to be approaching in this hybrid situation, we need to be approaching our instruction and our preparation from the virtual view. Let's think about planning for instruction with our virtual students in mind and how we bring in our face-to-face students. So with classroom management, the first thing that I have already shared with you all is the professional development. You want to make sure that you are well versed in using this GoMath curriculum and all of these tools as much as possible. You certainly can't spend all of your time trying to learn in GoMath. As K-5 teachers, you all are also teaching other subjects, but it is important that when you have this tool that you spend the time to learn about it. Next, with direct instruction. Some of the features that I viewed or that I played around with in GoMath that lend themselves to direct instruction were MegaMath. I loved the interactive whiteboard lessons. That speaks right to the hybrid environment. When you can use your whiteboard, open up your Zoom classroom, share your screen, and have that interactive whiteboard lesson, not only on the screen for your students who are virtual, but in front of the students in the Chromebook that are physically with you. That is dynamic. That's an opportunity to really go deep and to really provide some strong direct instruction that's the same for every student. Same thing with the iTools. All of your students and you have access to those iTools that are going to help with the virtual manipulatives and being able to do those things for modeling and those things for number and operations and for our algebraic thinking. All of those tools are embedded digitally so that both your students online and your students in person can engage. The share and show is perfect for differentiation. It lends itself to allowing students to learn at different levels and also to communicate about mathematics. And then modeling, as I said before, using those iTools, but also the animated modeling feature that they have in those virtual manipulatives and embedded in those lessons. All of those things can be incorporated virtually into your direct instruction. And you can use those things to make sure that your students, both online and in person, again, are getting that same experience. The most challenging is always going to be assessment. There's lots of individual practice built there in GoMath. The diagnostic practice that is digital is the show what you know. There was also diagnostic practice that was in a physical workbook. Again, if you must use print materials, then one of two things should happen. Those print materials get translated into editable forms in your Google Classroom so all students have access, or we need to snail mail that workbook to our students who are working virtually. And we need to provide a way for those students to get their answers back to us. Now, we can be as simple as a parent taking a picture of that assessment with the phone. But it is essential that those students who need to have those diagnostic, formative, or summative assessments come back to you in a format that is easy for them to get to you. So for the formative assessments, the share and show is one of the digital components within GoMath. The others were, again, in a physical workbook. And then again, the summative assessments were all in a digital or in a physical workbook. So again, all of those same strategies that I mentioned earlier. Several of you mentioned in the challenges with hybrid learning and the challenges with GoMath was about validity of the assessments. And again, that's a whole course in itself. What I will say, again, first and foremost, communicating with your parents is going to be essential here. It is so important that your parents understand it's okay for their students to struggle. They should not help their students when they are taking an assessment because you need to know what their students are learning. There are some ways to get around that. If you are giving an assessment in your physical classroom, it is absolutely appropriate to have cameras on and your students in your virtual classroom taking that assessment under your watch. That's probably the simplest way to ensure that the student is doing the work. If the camera goes off, If you see a parent coaching or helping the student, then it's imperative to stop that action immediately. But it's also imperative to follow your school processes and procedures when it comes to that. How is it that your administration wants you to communicate that that's happening to them? What is your classroom policy when students receive academic help? What is your academic dishonesty policy? And sharing that with parents for them to understand how that is academically dishonest and that your student assessment has to be completed exclusively by the student. Next was the small group. Within Go Math, you have the collaborative practice and you have the individual practice. Well, those things lend themselves to pulling students together in small groups, whether in a breakout room virtually or in smaller pods in your physical classroom. One of my favorite things, along with journaling, is that think, pair, share opportunity that students can have in a small group. You can absolutely do that in your virtual classroom by pulling students into breakout rooms if you don't want it to be too noisy. Or also, like I said, inviting your physical students into that virtual classroom, and everyone goes into breakout rooms. And then last but certainly not least, the learning materials. Go Math provides a lot of virtual manipulatives, and they provide a lot of additional resources that are going to lend themselves to digital learning materials that your students can use. There's also the National Library of Virtual Manipulatives. That is an older website, but there are also other resources that I'll share with you when we're in person to upgrade your learning materials so that they are virtual for all students. And now let's move on to wrapping up this session and talking about what will be in session 2. So our session 2 preview, we're going to talk next time about some of those priority strands that you all shared in the feedback survey. So you all shared with me what areas you felt like you needed some, none, or more support on. So the 3 that we're going to focus on are operations and algebraic thinking. That's number 1. Numbers and operations and measurement and data were tied for number 2. And then geometry was our 3rd most popular. So as we start to do some model lessons together, my plan is to have 2 model lessons for our next session. I would love your feedback on what those model lessons could be. I would love to know where you would like to see a model lesson on integrating Go Math into your hybrid classroom. So please let me know what you think. Let me know if you've done a lesson and you'd like to share that with me. I would love to take a look at it and then provide some suggestions or model that lesson for you with all of the things that we've talked about today. So if you'd like to reach out to me and share some of that with me, or give me some feedback on which of these strands you'd like to see 2 model lessons with next week, let me know. You can reach out to me by visiting our website. You can send me an email at heather@crossanddotllc.com, all spelled out. You can always give me a call at 404-754-3570. And then you can connect with us on social media at Instagram at crossanddot16, and then on Facebook and LinkedIn at crossanddotllc. I look forward to hearing from you all, Brookhaven Innovation Academy teachers. I look forward to meeting with you very soon in person. And I also look forward to our next session together next week. Have a wonderful day.